All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mira Devoda. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the voter campaign manager at the ACLU of Delaware. Thank you so much for joining us for the first part of our webinar series. Today's webinar will be focused on education equity in the upcoming midterm elections. And we have wonderful panelists who I will introduce very quickly before turning it over to our moderator today. So our panelists today include Shannon Griffin, who is the ACLU of Delaware Senior Policy Advocate and Education Equity Campaign Manager. We have Erin Kupchik, Professor of Sociology and Criminology, and a nationally recognized expert on implicit bias and restorative practices. And lastly, we have Adriana Bohm, who is a Red Clay School Board and ACLU board member and a staunch advocate for students and families in Delaware. Thanks for your patience, guys. I'm going to now turn it over to Cassidy Baptiste, our intern at the ACLU of Delaware, who will be moderating the Q&A section of this conversation. I just want to point out to anyone attending that you are free to drop Q&As into the chat or the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those questions after we finish our panelist discussion. So Cassidy, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, and the first question is, education equity might not be the first issue on many voters' minds, but when heading to the polls this election season, especially when voters are or don't have kids and are in school, and can you help, sorry, a little nervous. Can you help explain how education equity intertwines with other ballots and issues and everyday voters and how we should care about the equality of Delaware public schools?
I'll take that. This is Shannon Griffin with the ACLU, and I think it's important. Education overall is everyone is impacted, if you have children in school or not, because the outcomes of a good public education can impact positively or negatively on our way of life. And so it's really important that everyone really pays attention to the status of our public education system. And in Delaware, unfortunately, we have had generations of inequity in our schools. When we look at the achievement gaps that our children have among Black and Brown students and students with special education needs, it is stark and it is alarming. And anyone and everyone should care, should show up to board meetings to ask questions. It's beyond just having a good, it's important to note that it's not just about having a good education, but what a good education brings you, what it offers you, the opportunities that it provides. And so if our students don't have access to a quality education, they limit their opportunities, which then impacts what they do after they get out of high school, right? The kinds of jobs they can receive. Can they get livable wage jobs? And education intersects everything. It intersects mental health, health outcomes. It intersects the criminal justice system. So it's really important. Education is the linchpin, in my view, to a great quality of life, and everyone should care about that.
I can add a few remarks as well. So to me, when we're thinking about educational equity, we're talking about all students having access to the resources they need to be successful. So when we think about educational equity and how it intertwines with other key ballot issues, the first thing that comes to my mind is crime and safety, because I know that's what a lot of people are talking about. So to tackle crime and safety, I think a great educational issue to focus on would be universal pre-K. So when pre-K students learn self-regulation skills, we know that pre-K boosts pre-literacy skills through sound, songs, games, and music. We know pre-K students are less likely to be held back. That means if they have access to pre-K. We know that if students have access to pre-K, that's also more likely to reduce special ed placement. We know pre-K results in higher graduation rates. We know that pre-K results and reduced levels of engagement in violence and crime. It reduces chronic offenses. That's when people are arrested 4 more times. We know that it reduces incarceration rates. And what's really interesting is that law enforcement is very united in its support of early childhood education as a strategy for crime prevention. Just recently, there was a recent survey that was conducted by George Mason University, where police chiefs were asked to rate various strategies on their value as crime prevention tools. And many of them listed high quality early learning and care as the #1 strategy to reduce crime in school and out of school. And this was more effective, they said, than trying juveniles as adults, building more juvenile detention facilities, and even installing more metal detectors in schools. And we know that nearly 9 out of 10 police chiefs said that America could greatly reduce crime if we just expanded early pre-K access. We also know that people who have access to early pre-K, they're less likely to go on public assistance during the course of their lives, right? So if we look at universal pre-K and we provide it free, we provide it with transportation, and we pay our teachers more, right? Our early childhood education teachers more. We know that that's a great method of reducing stress that people have over crime and public safety, which is not necessarily an educational issue, right? But I know part of the question was, well, what about people and families who may not have children, or maybe their children aren't grown up? Education's still really important in this way, right? So I think that's one of the ways we can look to see how these educational issues are intertwined with other issues that the public's really concerned about, whether they have children or not.
If I can also add a couple thoughts, though I'm probably foolish to, because those are both really great and powerful comments. But I wanted to add that how educational equity is also central to broader issues of civil and racial justice. And I just wanted to briefly point out that it's not a coincidence that really maybe one of the pivotal moments in the 20th century battle for civil rights, and perhaps the key Supreme Court case, was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when the NAACP wanted to expand civil rights to attack and end Jim Crow segregation. They did throw by attacking segregation in schools. Which is not only symbolically, but I think actually very powerful, and really shows that education equity is, for all the reasons that my colleague said, so key to broader equity issues, particularly racial equity.
All right, Cassidy. Oh, sorry, Cassidy, go ahead.
You're good. I was just seeing if that was the last answer. So we're just gonna go over to a quick video to kind of explain everything and a little background about what we're about to discuss.
ACLU is committed to all children having a quality public school education. We believe this is a civil right. Gender, race, ethnicity, the zip code, none of this should dictate one's ability to reach their full potential. The goal of the Equity in Education project is to work with schools, administrators, educators, parents, and students to making sure that they're building inclusive environments, ensuring equity in discipline practices, accessing programs and services, including rigorous coursework. This is all vital if we're going to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our students, and most importantly, helping them to maximize their potential.
First and foremost, there has to be shared understanding and collaborative planning and action that includes school board members, state and district leaders, civil rights advocates, families, educators, and students themselves.
I think we're very intentional about the family dynamics and the family units. When our families enroll, it's almost like we're enrolling the entire family unit. So we get to know the student, but we also are there to sort of find out, what the parent needs, their view on academics, their view on just life structures. And so when we're building the relationship with the student, we're also building the relationship with the parent.
Tennessee is a place to be. We laugh, we learn, we will succeed. Jack strong, Jack smart, just come and see. CSNC is where you'll find me.
In a couple of my schools, there have been, I would say, organized chaos. The difference here is totally different. It's not organized chaos. It's more of the teachers had the opportunity to take the initiative to do certain things in the school, as well as the principal and the executive director gives us the ownership to do that. So I really like that about Charter School in Newcastle.
Dealing with spec ed, I think in relation to restorative practices, it's really important to keep that positive relationship. So if there's anything that needs to be repaired or restored, we have to make sure we maintain a positive relationship even through the discipline or the harder things about my job. Being engaged for action, I've seen the students grow a lot. They've become more confident, they're more comfortable with speaking out, giving their opinions, and I think they've become stronger leaders. They really got into the homeless project, and they really were passionate about it and compassionate, and I think that it was easier for them to be so involved because they cared about the cause.
It was basically about how we could make care packages and send it to a homeless shelter so the homeless can have more supplies and materials so they can have a better life.
I put a lot of care in the project because I didn't know how much the homeless needed these stuff this bad.
It helps them inspire people and take pride in the school.
And I would tell them to join because it's a really fun thing to do, to take care of your school.
And it will help them come out of their shell.
Talking to the kids, you really gain a lot of reasoning behind why these partnerships are important, because they get a lot out of it, more than you think.
We're intentional. We respond to the needs of our students, respond to the feedback that we receive from our parents and our teachers. And when you create an environment that parents, number one, want to be a part of, so I think that's the first step, create an environment that they want to be a part of, but it's important to have their voice involved because they are their students' first teacher. So how are we going to teach them if we're not engaging with their first teacher? So when you think about that community feel, where are students spending the majority of their time, at home or at school? We can't not partner together. It makes too much of an impact on that student. And if we want to do what's best for the student, then we're absolutely partnering with their family to make sure we're on the same page and that we're speaking the same language.
I think the committee allows you to really see what's going on in the school, see what goes on behind the scenes. Too often we, come in the morning, drop them off and, go about our day, never understanding or realizing, behind the scenes, there's things going on that take away from the child's learning, take away from the needs that they have. So I think it's important that, we just ask a couple questions, just look a little deeper and see what's going on with your child's school, make sure it's really what you need, what your child needs.
I feel like it changed a whole lot. It gave me an open-minded of how the teachers are working, how they are trying, but it also gives me a second chance to look at how parents are involving. How if parents get involved in more can happen.
History proves systems do not transform themselves. It takes consistent and persistent pressure.
So if you have a clear understanding of the path forward that you would like your students, your families, your staff to take as far as real civic leadership, community support, community partnerships, and that is a desire as part of your mission, then I would say, it's important to partner with programs that are already doing that.
All right, so I think we're ready for our next question. With the 2022 primary elections just a few weeks away, can you help paint a picture of the current state of affairs in Delaware public schools and where we have been in progress and what obstacles still remain. And just a quick little reminder for the viewers, please feel at any moment in time to just go in the chat box and ask away.
I want to put Adriana on the spot, Dr. Bohm, as our resident and current school board member. I think she is perfectly suited to answer this question first.
Okay, so what I will say is that we've definitely seen sparkles of progress right over the years. So one of the huge things, and I'm really going to talk about Red Clay because that's the district that I live in, that I went to school in, that I'm a school board member of, and that my children go to school in. So I'm sorry about the other districts. I just don't know that much about them. In a general sense, I do, but Red Clay is sort of my focus. So we have had some really great, like I would say, wins or successes. So one huge win is that we fought for many years to get a student and students on the school board, and we got that, right? Another huge win across the state was that during the pandemic, a lot of students organized around creating BSUs. And so we had BSUs, Black Student Unions, that were created and evolved in schools, but also on district levels and also across the state, right? So we had a statewide BSU that evolved. That was absolutely phenomenal. It was student-led, student-driven, student-initiated. Another big win in our district is we fought really hard to create policy. It was School Board Policy 8005. And it was the policy to protect our transgender students and our gender fluid student population. And we had literally thousands of emails, hours long discussions that lasted months, right? But we finally were able to pass it with a 4-3 vote, which was very, very exciting and a really big win for our students. So those are some of the bright spots on the horizon that we were looking at and organizing around, and we were able to actualize. But then there's still at the same time a tremendous amount of work to be done, right? So one of the things we just recently heard in Red Clay from some of our student school board representatives, because we have one from each school, so we have a lot of them, and one from each high school. One of the things they're really concerned about is student curricula and what they're reading and being exposed to and who's making those decisions, and they want to have access and input into what they're learning, which I think is 100%. They should have access. The other thing we're hearing a lot about from students is that they don't feel that they're being given information on school safety. They don't know about school procedures to ensure safety. They don't know what the district's doing. So those have been two big asks from our student body just in the last few weeks. And so I want to talk a little bit about this school safety committee. So one of the things that a number of years ago, and Aaron and Shannon were in the process of organizing around this issue, we created the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor resolution, which was the ask to get SROs, which are school resource officers, out of our schools and use the $90,000 we allotted for each school resource officer to take that money and put it towards school psychologists and social workers and community-based interventionists, et cetera. We lost that vote by we lost it. 5 voted against it, 2 voted for it. In the aftermath of that vote, we voted to create a committee that looked at school resource officers and public safety. That committee never got off the ground, even though it was unanimously voted on. But I've initiated a motion last month to get a school safety committee up and off the ground again, because when we've looked at all of the recent school shootings, we looked at the work on the school to prison pipeline, we've looked at what policies and programs really are effective in reducing school violence. We know that just increasing police and SROs in schools is not an effective strategy. And we also know that school safety means very different things to very different constituencies, right? So if we really want to focus, I think, on school safety and making our schools safer, which is an area we need to do a lot of work on, there are things we can do, like introducing a weighted funding formula, having an ombuds person, right? We can also do things like having more adults in schools that children feel safe communicating with and telling them, you know, if there's a problem or an issue, or even if they've heard of something that's going to happen, right? So to have those connections with adults. But we also can look at more systems level changes like community-based programming efforts that we see happening all across the country that are really, really effective. So even in the Delaware News Journal, in July, they had a big article on the Newark Community Street Team and the work those adults were doing in the community of Newark, New Jersey, in actually reducing not just violence, but homicides. We have Dads on Duty, which is a program that has fathers going into schools, fathers who live in the communities the kids go to, working with the students in the school, and that's an effective strategy. We have Daryl Wolfie Chambers right here in Wilmington doing a lot of work. So I think there's lots of initiatives we can look at and lots of real programs that currently exist that we could model our work after to really reduce violence in school.
Thank you, Dr. Bohm. If I can continue on that, I'm a sociologist and criminologist at University of Delaware, and most of my research looks at school policing, school punishment, racial bias, and these issues, and so on. And Dr. Bohm is absolutely right. When talking about where we are and where we're going in schools, we're still in this pandemic, which is such an enormous challenge to schools, which have so many needs. And it was so disheartening that the Delaware legislature recently passed House Bill 388, which provides more funds for police in schools, a strategy that's been shown ineffective. Ironically, after the biggest ever public failure of policing, the solution has been to give more money to police in schools. The research consistently shows that putting police officers in schools does more harm than good. I'm not talking about bad officers. I'm not being anti-officer. My research shows that these officers that I've met, at least, are just phenomenal human beings who care about children. And yet when we put more police in schools, we criminalize students. More minor incidents result in not just arrest, but also suspensions, things that SROs aren't supposed to be involved in. And students of color bear the brunt of this. They're disproportionately likely to be reported for either. The research shows that putting more police in schools does not have the expected effect on school safety for a variety of complex reasons that I don't need to get into it at this moment. But so in thinking about school safety, there's so many better options, and it was really disheartening to see that money going towards the one option, or one of the options that we know is ineffective.
If that was our last answer, or if you have anything to say, Shannon, you're good.
No, I'm good. I think they've answered it really well.
All right. So next question is, centuries of racism has created an education system that offers vastly different experiences for children of color specifically. Experiences for children who live in different parts of our state. Schools in historically Black and brown neighborhoods have underfunded and experience high teacher and administration turnovers, leaving resources gaps wide enough for entire communities to fall through. What are the direct implications of funding gap and staff turnovers have on communities and children affected most?
So I'll field this one first. This is Shannon. I think that it directly impacts the quality of education. And it's important to note that the state settled a lawsuit that was brought forth that highlighted funding inequities in schools that had high poverty populations and that had high populations of students with ELL, which means English language was not their first language. And also that our school systems were not funded by the state for special education from K to third grade. So that lawsuit was settled. So we know, and many have known, that the inequities exist. And when we look at the numbers of classrooms who have highly effective, not just highly qualified, because most, folks get a degree, they get a master's, they get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and they pass, the teacher certification that makes them highly qualified, but not necessarily highly effective, right? So when we look at where the highly effective teachers are, unfortunately, we don't have enough of them in schools that are considered Title I, which is the higher poverty schools. And so the correlation between having a highly effective teacher and in a classroom is if one of, if not the top correlation between students reading on grade level, being able to be proficient in math at grade level. And so when we have that, that's one of the obvious deficits that we have. And it's not just in Wilmington schools. I want folks to really realize this is a statewide issue, right? These issues affect kids all across our state. And so there's a direct impact.
And we have another question. What policies and initiatives have voters look for when choosing candidates, and who are willing to take steps to address both issues?
Cassidy, can I just jump in and just offer a few additional comments on the previous question? So I just want to pick up where Shannon left off, because what Shannon said was 100% correct and great. If we look at really specific things in our public schools, I want to just start out by saying that high poverty schools are usually our Black and brown schools, right? So we have a lot of racial segregation and a lot of income segregation and a lot of segregation in terms of who's speaking what language in our schools as well. And so when we look at our high poverty schools, I always want us to keep in mind that they're usually Black and brown schools, right? So that's another layer there. But we have, what you'll find is high poverty schools have a lot of instability, and we know that students thrive in stable environments just like all other people do, right? So if you look at a school like Warner, which is one of our highest poverty schools in the district, Warner had over 5 to 6 principals in less than 10 years because you have the principal turnover at such a high rate. You have really high staff turnover where staff want to leave and they ask for voluntary transfers out of the schools because they don't want to teach in that environment for a whole plethora of reasons, right? Like Shannon said, we have fewer expertly trained content certified teachers. We have more substitutes. We have more long-term substitutes. We have more people who call out sick. We have more people who take extended sick leave. So you have long-term substitutes. You also have often a lack of culturally competent professional development for the people who work in the buildings. And that's highly problematic because many of the people who work in the buildings are wonderful people. However, they haven't grown up in the environments that these students have grown up in, our students have grown up in. I also want to just make a quick note about the infrastructure and the physical appearance and workingness of our buildings, right? So in our high poverty schools, you're much more likely to have leaking ceilings, stained walls, broken windows, toilets that don't operate, water fountains that don't work or spew out brown water, right? You're more likely to have air conditioning issues. You're more likely to have sour milk in the cafeteria. So those are all building level issues that really shine through when we begin to look at high poverty schools. We have fewer TAG programs, which are talented and gifted programs. That's because when we have additional units, they're used for necessary and required subjects like learning how to read and learning how to write. So they can't go into like the other programs like a talented and gifted program. And just I had just a few more. The other thing is that you find in high poverty schools, they're a lot less likely to have extracurricular activities like Odyssey of the Mind, Lego League, Girls Can Do Anything, Girls Can Run, right? All of those programs, they're a lot less likely to exist in a high poverty school. You also have a likelihood of more, so our K through third grade classes are supposed to have a student limit, so they're supposed to have low class sizes. However, in high poverty schools, you're more likely to ask the state and the legislators for a waiver to reduce the low numbers of the children in the classroom and increase the number of students in the classroom because you don't have the infrastructure to support those small class sizes, right? So there are lots and lots of things that happen when we have high poverty schools, and every single one of those things go to helping students be less successful rather than more successful. And we know that schools, according to national data, once schools reach a 40% poverty threshold, everyone's grades begin to go down, even students who come from higher income families. So concentrated poverty simply does not work as an educational model for success.
Cassie, may I jump in on the next the follow-up question you'd asked about policy? And as I do so, I'm going to say something I think is probably going to be pretty unpopular, because I'm going to address school choice in charter schools. You know, especially unpopular after seeing that excellent video, which shows amazing work being done by amazing people with amazing students and parents and all. But when we have a system like Delaware's that relies so much on choice and charter schools, on opting out of zone schools or opting out of the public school system into private companies run, you know, charter schools are operated not by public entities. These policies are part of our problem. They're part of our longstanding problem in the state of Delaware, and they provide short-term solutions often. And I appreciate parents' right and desire to get the best possible environment for their child. But when we allow parents to shop in this way, what tends to happen is the parents with the most social and political power wind up with the best teachers and the best schools, leaving those who already started out at a disadvantage at a worse disadvantage. And yes, they're open, but not everyone has the same confidence navigating bureaucratic systems of education. Not everybody has the same access to information and so on. And so they increase inequity, these systems of choice and opting out of the public school system. So in thinking about what policies, as Cassie asked, what policies should voters look for? My probably unpopular encouragement is to look for policies and policymakers and policies that support equity, not necessarily privatization of public goods or shopping by parents.
And I can add a little bit to that as well. I think that one of the things that voters should look for when they're trying to assess what candidates they want to vote for is not just what candidates say they're interested in, but the actions candidates have engaged in around of some of the educational issues and debates that we've had in Delaware. So one great example to follow up with what Dr. Kupchik just said was that HB 238 was heard this session, and that was to remove the 5-mile radius around charter schools that gave preference to people who lived within that 5-mile radius. So legislation that is, you know, has really controversial sides. Where do these people running for office, where do they fall on issues like that, right? Where do they fall on HB 198, which was passed? Where do they fall? I have a bunch of bills here. I'm not going to read them all. But where do they fall on HB 317, which was providing medical coverage for all students in the state? Our school board voted against supporting that legislation. Now, you would think that would be something students, we want all students to have medical care. Our board fought very hard to make the argument that they shouldn't support legislation that would give that medical coverage to all children, right? So where do people fall on something like that? Where do they fall on House Substitute 1 for HB 377, which is giving salary increases to our pre-K educators, right? Where did they vote on HB 388, which is the bill that Dr. Kupchik talked about, which gave more funding for police in school, right? What do they feel about the weighted funding formula? What do they feel about the case that the ACLU and then NAACP had, right? What do they feel about supporting an ombudsperson? So really to look at direct lines of action, that's what I would encourage people to do, because we can all say things, and on easy legislation that mostly everyone's going to agree on, that's not the hard part. We need to get into those hard areas where we have controversial legislation. And I'll tell you a new controversial piece of legislation that's coming up. It's HB 396, and it's being discussed right now. And that's legislation that's asking right now the AG's office, if a student gets in trouble and commits a crime or is accused of committing a crime outside of school, and the crime has nothing to do with school, that police report is still sent to the schools, and students are now getting in trouble outside of school by the police, and then they're getting in trouble again in school by school administrators for a crime that they committed that was outside of school. So there's talk to get that double whammy impact removed, and there's a tremendous amount of controversy over that, right? So where do people stand on a bill, something like that?
And I just want to add that really quickly. And these are alleged crimes, right? So oftentimes, their kids are getting all kind of charges, right? And then they could be thrown out. They could be significantly reduced by the time it actually, it begins to be adjudicated. Meanwhile, students have missed months, if not a full year of education. And so that's not due process, right? That's not how our system should function.
All right. Our next question is, the school to prison pipeline refers to the disturbing national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools and into juvenile and criminal justice systems. Implicit biases against Black and brown children cause them to experience harsher discipline than the white counterparts. What are the restorative justice practices, and how do you practice these benefits? How do these practices benefit children, families, and communities?
I'm going to let Dr. Kupchak handle that one.
I was just going to jump in and say, I hope you don't mind if I do. Thank you. No, and I'm happy to answer it because this is really in my wheelhouse. These are issues that I spend a lot of time thinking about and researching. First, let me say it's absolutely true that Black and brown children experience harsher discipline, and it comes with great harm. Research has shown extensive harms that schools tend to use suspension far more than is necessary. It's typically not for things one might be afraid of. It's typically not for violence, drug use, weapons, and so on. It's typically for talking back to teachers, for defying authority, for violating dress code, for tardiness, for truancy. And what schools too often do is we kick kids out for doing these things, which makes them fall further behind. Right? Most teachers will tell you that students tend to act out in these ways because they don't understand what's happening in classes. And so when we kick them out, it makes the problem grow. And this is an enormous nationwide problem, particularly for Black and brown children who are far more likely to suffer this than others. It doesn't just hurt them, it hurts their future, their ability to finish their education, to financially provide. It hurts their families, it hurts their communities, it hurts the entire schools. The schools are actually worse off when they do this. So yes, absolutely, study after study has found this problem to be true. And I should add, and it is not a function necessarily of students' behavior. It's not just that it's certainly not the case that Black and brown children act up more, misbehave more, and so they're punished more. They are being singled out for punishment unintentionally for hopefully most cases, but they're being singled out for punishment. So I appreciate the question because it turns us towards restorative justice practices. And the goal of restorative practices is to recognize that kicking kids out of school hurts everyone, hurts the school. It's a temporary salve, it's a temporary benefit to a teacher, but it makes the long-term problem worse, right? So instead of helping the teacher and supporting the teacher deal with the behavior, we're long-term making the problem worse. Restorative practices instead try to restore what's been harmed. They try to address why a student is misbehaving and see if we can fix the issues. If it's about not understanding what's happening in class, then perhaps some tutoring is required, right? If it's that two students have an agreement, then having some conflict mediation by a trained provider can help resolve the issue. There are consequences to students. It's not an avoidance of punishment. It certainly is important to have consequences, but it does so in a way that tries to restore what's been harmed and bring the student back as a valued member of a community. When I explain this, I often try to make the comparison to how we'd want our children treated in schools, or even better, how families work. You know, I have two kids who are also in the Red Clay district, and you know, as any parent can tell you, when your kids misbehave, as they all do, you know, there should be consequences, right? There need to be consequences. There need to be rules that are enforced for the good of the family, for the good of the children's learning. But when the children violate the rules, I mean, there's nothing my kids could do that would make them not a part of my family, ever, right? So when my children violate rules, they can be punished and receive the consequences, and then brought back in with love and with teaching and with correction of behavior. Suspensions do none of those things. Right? And so that's what restorative practices are about. I should add, I'm sorry, before I turn it over, just evaluation research looking at restorative practices finds that they're effective, certainly more effective than exclusionary punishment, excluding children like suspensions or expulsions. I'll stop there.
I think it's important to reiterate what Dr. Kupchak said, is that restorative practice is not in the absence of a consequence. It's just a different and a better way to address what has happened, the harm that may have been caused. And it's providing a voice, not just for the person who was impacted negatively, but the person who actually did the negative behavior. And so I think we can empower our students much more than we currently do, right? We can help to make sure that they are a part of the school culture. Right now, it's very much do as we say, right? When we work with community, when we work with our students, when we work with our parents, when we work with our educators, our outcomes are just so much better than having these kind of arbitrary rules and regulations that we're to follow. And we haven't received input, and we haven't done that in a collaborative way. So I just wanted to note that. Dr. Baum?
Yeah, so I would just say that when I'm thinking about restorative justice and restorative practices, I think the aim is to say, how can we reimagine handling problematic situations that arise in our schools? So I went to all public schools. My kids went to a Title I school for K through 5th grade. I have a daughter in high school now. I mean, children misbehave, children fight within their own households, they fight within their communities, with members of their communities, which are often an extension of their households. And how can we address this conflict through a more humanitarian lens, right? And reimagine how to enact, and I'm going to say discipline, even though that's not the word I want to use, I'm going to put it in quotes, right? How do we enact a more positive way of dealing with those things? And I'm just going to throw some stats out there. We know that 75% of our people locked up in prisons have been pushed out of high schools. They don't have a high school diploma, most of them. We know that close to 60, Monique Morris shares in her book Push Out, we know that close to 60% of all girls who are arrested in schools have been raped. And then they fight and get in trouble, and then they get arrested and put into prison or juvenile delinquency facilities. So when we have numbers like that and stats like that, I think it really propels us to say, does pushing these children, our kids, out of schools result in something positive for them? Or what methods can we use that promote inclusion, that promote social engagement, that promote really kids talking to one another and figuring out why they're angry about things, right? How we can get our children to be more accountable, just like we're trying to get adults to be more accountable, right? How can we get these things on the agenda and on the table? I'm a mom. Children need to have some repercussion when they misbehave. I'm also an educator. I know that. I have kids in my classroom all the time. But does it have to be in the form of criminalizing behavior that is often not felony type of behavior that's occurring in the classroom, right? And I think that's really the model. And I think if we look at, my parents' generations, many children, I'm 53, many people of my generation were hit by their parents. I certainly was hit by both my mother and my father. And then I think our generation, people who have teenagers now, are saying, well, perhaps there's a different way we can do it. Let's look at the research. The research shows that really hitting our kids doesn't work. It's not an effective strategy. So we're trying to do something different. So I think in education right now, those of us who are espousing restorative justice practices are saying the same thing, like, hey, we have that old model, it didn't work, look at the research. We're science-based, we want to look at the research, we always want to come back to that. So that's what I have to say.
The recent implemented Delaware, next question. In what ways should our elected officials ensure that the ombudsperson program framework is allowed to grow and become most impactful?
So I'll answer that question. So just a quick, the little context. So the Delaware Public Education Ombudsperson Program was initiated out of the funding lawsuit settlement that said parents need a way to be able to help to resolve disputes, issues, disparities that their students may be encountering in a way that is student and family centered and focused, right? And so the state agreed to help fund the creation of this Delaware Education Ombudsperson program to do just that. It is designed to be a statewide program for free if your child attends a public school, including charter, because charters are public schools as well, across the state. And so they handle issues from bullying, harassment, excessive discipline issues, access to programs and services, just to name a few. So that's what this office is. It's important because it's really the only avenue that parents have that's not directly connected to the Delaware Department of Education, right? So it's an independence to function, right? And so while it's important that it works collaboratively with the public school system, it operates independently of, and that's critical. And so the potential that this office has is really huge. One thing that I would hope that we could actually have folks do that think this is an important initiative to support is that it needs more funding, right? It was only granted $1 million out of the original settlement. And for a statewide program, that's just woefully inadequate. And so we want folks to reach out to their legislators to say, hey, the Ombudsperson program is important and it needs more dollars associated. So they can hire the staff, because each family is assigned an advocate that actually works with the families from start to finish. And that includes attending meetings, making phone calls, sending emails, you name it. And so we want to make sure that this is a functioning office, right? And it needs to be codified. So we're looking to push legislation, actually, Representative Nanu Kocha introduced HC 87. It was pulled late in the session, but they're going to reintroduce it, that would codify the office, right? That would help to establish this office so that it doesn't go away with an incoming administration or, when the political winds shift, that they don't think it's an important thing, that it goes away. So it's important that we codify this office. And so that legislation is going to be reintroduced this upcoming session. And so getting folks to contact their legislators to say they support this will be really helpful.
To address the audience questions, what solutions and methods are proposing to get caregivers involved, and how are you to get that message to the general public?
So I put a couple of solutions in the chat, but I think we have to think about schools are cultures, right? So how do you change the culture of teaching? And so it has to be much more inclusive. It needs to be much more welcoming. Our educators need way more supports than they're currently receiving. And that starts from in-service teachers, folks who before they even get full-time in the classroom, right? They need to be more supported. There needs to be much more mentorship for teachers. And so when we look at how the actual, bodies in classrooms, so there should at least be a full-time paraprofessional in classrooms that would help support classroom management, that would help to support, what's happening on a day-to-day basis inside of those classrooms. We have to provide more ongoing training and coaching. And so one things I hear all the time from teachers is, listen, we are professional development to death, right? They get herded in the first beginning of the school year for a day or 2 hours of training on any given topic. And then they're supposed to be able to master it, implement it, and it goes away. This work requires ongoing coaching. And so there has to be funding to allow for that to happen. So they're working with experts like Dr. Kupchak and others who understand implicit and bias and how it actually unfolds in a classroom or in a school building. They're actually working with them, working through issues, working through as things arise, helping to do course corrections, helping to have those guided conversations. So providing more PD and coaching is essential. And also we have to look at how we're engaging our students, right? How do we help to make sure we're fostering space for them, for their voices, right? If they feel like the school belongs to them and they are a part of the school, you will be amazed at how then you'll see less behavior issues, because then students start to check themselves. I've seen it, right? When we empower students and they begin to understand that they own and drive the culture of their school building, but you have to make space for that. And so how does that happen? Well, it takes deliberate training. It takes deliberate planning. And so a lot of our schools are operating in, it's like a knee-jerk kind of, reactionary status. And so we've got to be more proactive in how we are addressing these issues. It takes deliberate planning. It takes deliberate time. And most of all, it takes those resources and how we're held accountable for the resources that we're given, right? Where is the accountability? We've now have millions and millions of dollars that are pumped into our public schools, but we haven't seen the kind of millions and millions of dollars worth of, of positive outcomes from that. So clearly there's a disconnect there. So where's the accountability leverage lie? Are actual classroom teachers or principals, and do they have the kind of autonomy to actually address issues that are happening at their local level? And so the solutions there are varied and they are wide. And I'll leave it there and let Dr. Kupchak or Dr. Bohm answer as well.
That was an amazing answer, Shannon. Thank you. You just stressed so many things that I want to mention, and I'm happy you did. But I want to add to that for those listening, that people might be thinking, well, where are we going to get that money from? Where are we going to get the time from? And I want to bring out that we do so many things currently. Again, I focus primarily on school punishment, school policing, and we spend so much money ineffectively and spend so much time ineffectively on how we police and punish students in school. There is a lot of money that could be salvaged, a lot of time that could be salvaged, a lot of effort of teachers that could be salvaged and repurposed towards just following the evidence. As Shannon perfectly well said, she's absolutely right. The single best way that we know to prevent school crime is to make more inclusive social climates where students feel a part of the school. And think about it. If you're a student, you're much less likely to hurt other people or the environment itself when you feel trusted and valued and belonging to it, right? But instead, we push them out. We alienate them. We make students too often feel that they are not trusted because they're not. So the point I just wanted to add is, with an amen to all that you just mentioned, it doesn't necessarily need to be $1 billion more into the school system. I don't know what the right amount is, but there are things we can redirect that make teachers' lives easier.
So we're going to begin to wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it back over to Mira.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I wanted to just shout out Cassidy real quick for moderating today. Cassidy is a student, so we're having a Delaware student moderate this event, and she got involved with us because of her interest in education equity work. So Cassidy, thank you so much for moderating tonight's event. You did an excellent job. Thank you to our panelists as well for your brilliant insights and for really getting us motivated and pumped ahead of these primaries. So the last thing that I want to leave you with, and I'll wrap it up quickly because I know it's dinner time or past, but I just wanted to direct all of you towards votedelaware.org. And Vote Delaware is our voter information hub. So everything that our panelists discussed today regarding our education equity platform and what it means to cast a pro-education equity ballot is listed out on that website for you to really delve into on your own time and share with your networks as well. So the next step after educating ourselves on what education equity actually means is to take that step to cast our ballot. Voting in no way is our final solution, but it's a step towards our destination and a step towards getting these policies implemented in Delaware schools. So I just wanted to leave you with that resource and also advise you to check out our new Delaware voting laws that are actually outlined on that website as well. So this year, Delaware is introducing vote by mail. same-day registration, and early voting. These are three incredibly significant voting changes in Delaware that really open up access to the ballot to a lot of communities that might struggle to make it on election day, or, forget a voter registration deadline, which should never, ever be a barrier to participating in democracy if that's what you want to do. So check out those new voting policies, check out our education equity platform. Join us for the rest of our webinar series. Our next webinar is this Thursday. We'll be focusing on our Smart Justice platform. So once again, thank you so much to Cassidy, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Priya, who's doing all of our behind the scenes comms work to make this webinar possible. This will be recorded and shared for future reference. So have an excellent night, everyone. Thank you so much again, and we'll be in touch.